All right, this is part two of our lecture on later members of genus Homo. This PowerPoint presentation will correlate with chapter 11 and 12 in the Explorations textbook, as well as Lab 16. All right, so we just finished talking about Homo heidelbergensis, which is generally considered to be the common ancestor of both us, Homo sapiens, and the Neanderthals. All right, let's talk more specifically about Homo neanderthalensis. So the majority of Neanderthal fossils that we see in the fossil record are uncovered in sites in Europe, the Middle East, and Western Asia between about 130,000 to as recently as 30,000 years before present. Anatomical features, very large cranial capacity, the largest that we've seen so far, between 1,200 to about 1,700 cc's. The cranial capacity of Neanderthals is on average slightly larger than what we see in modern humans, Homo sapiens, but Neanderthals in general are more robust. They have larger skeletal anatomy, thicker postcranial bones, and generally more muscular than Homo sapiens. You see features such as the presence of the occipital bun. So if you remember back from our osteology sections, the occipital region is in the back of the skull, and the occipital bun is a protrusion that would be the attachment point for the nuchal ligament. So that's essentially the ligament in your neck that prevents your head from pitching back and forth during bipedal walking, running, jogging, etc. Relatively large nasal opening or nasal aperture. That's an adaptation to the cold. The Neanderthals existed during the last Pleistocene or the last Ice Age. So they have a lot of skeletal and behavioral adaptations that allowed for their existence and their success during the Ice Age. No chin, or what you call either a vertical or receding mandibular symphysis. So that essentially means that when you feel from the lower jaw, from the lower dentition here, all the way down to the chin, it's not going to be protruding like you would see in modern Homo sapiens. It will be either vertical or even receding. The postcranial anatomy, the limbs are massive, very robust or thick bones. They are cold adapted, so their overall stature is short and heavily muscled. If you think back to the human adaptation section, even modern human populations that can trace their ancestry back to colder regions are going to be shorter and stouter and more robust. Based upon nuclear DNA studies that have been done over the last 20 years, it is very likely that Neanderthals interbred successfully with Homo sapiens and produced viable fertile offspring. So these DNA studies have even called into question whether or not we should consider the Neanderthals to be a completely separate species, or whether they're just a geographical variant or subspecies of Homo sapiens. All right, so some of the behavioral characteristics based upon skeletal anatomy, the remains that we see with Neanderthals or stone tool technologies, they likely hunted large, dangerous game, and they utilized hunting strategies that required them to be close to dangerous game. So they were using stone tool points on the end of a wooden shaft. So you can imagine if they're very close to dangerous game, that means that they were oftentimes injured or possibly even killed during the hunting process. But just because they hunted game doesn't mean they didn't also eat other food sources. Based upon dental calculus and wear marks on the teeth, the dentition, they likely also ate plants and tubers, just like all hominins do. They utilize a stone tool technology called Mousterian tools. These tools are more sophisticated and complex than the Acheulean tools that we saw with Homo erectus. There's that they had compassion, language, and symbolic expression. We'll talk about the Shanidar specimen that displays evidence or provides evidence that they cared for their sick and disabled. Based upon DNA studies, they've isolated the FOXP2 gene, which is a gene that is closely associated with language. So it is likely that Neanderthals did in fact have language based upon the FOXP2 gene, as well as the structure of the hyoid bone, that's the U-shaped bone in the vocal tract. And they likely consumed plants for medicinal purposes. And we see plenty of examples of complex symbolic expression, symbolic and intentional burials. We also see a site in Iberia that displays examples of pigmented and perforated shell beads that may have been used as jewelry or possibly even makeup kits. And they symbolically and intentionally buried their dead, which is a difference that we see. We don't really see a whole lot of evidence for this prior to the Neanderthal fossils. There's a couple exceptions we'll talk about. So these are the Mousterian tools that I was talking about. So these are more refined and more sophisticated than the Acheulean tools that we saw with Homo erectus. Like I mentioned, their hunting techniques and strategies required them to be very close to large, dangerous game. It's generally hypothesized that Neanderthals focused more exclusively on terrestrial food sources, whereas Homo sapiens utilized a more diverse, both aquatic and terrestrial sources, which could have been one of the reasons why Homo sapiens had a slight advantage. Because again, going off what we know on evolution so far, if you have a diverse diet, you're essentially more adaptable. If one food source is all of a sudden unavailable, then you can simply switch to other food sources if you have a diverse diet. So it's very possible that Neanderthals were simply too specialized. They were specialized on focusing on the food resources that were available during the last Pleistocene, whereas Homo sapiens that originated in Africa had a more diverse diet and possibly more complex and sophisticated hunting strategies. So the skeletal remains of Neanderthals has sometimes been compared to modern day rodeo riders. So lots of skeletal fractures. Sometimes it healed, sometimes it didn't. When you're looking at skeletal remains, you can determine whether or not that individual healed from his or her injury or whether they died from that injury. And also stable isotope studies, that's essentially extracting carbon from the bone. They were able to determine that Neanderthals definitely focused pretty heavily on terrestrial protein sources, and the meat in the diet was extremely important. Again, thinking about the brain being a very metabolically expensive organ, so the Neanderthals had a large cranial capacity combined with a large body size. So you can imagine that they needed to consume a high quantity of quality protein and other food sources in order to survive during the last ice age. So there is evidence that Neanderthals showed compassion for one another. This is a famous fossil that's associated with the Neanderthals. This is Shanidar 1 specimen, and you can see the humerus, the right humerus, is heavily atrophied. However, it is healed, so it indicated that this particular individual suffered a traumatic injury and possibly even had his lower arm amputated. However, he survived. But you can imagine, in order to survive during the Ice Age with only one arm, you likely had to rely upon your social group for survival. So this is oftentimes used as evidence that Neanderthals placed a high degree of importance upon their social group and helped each other survive. They weren't just out for their own survival, they were out for the survival of their group. Other evidence of symbolism, complex symbolism among Neanderthals. There are several Neanderthal burials that show that they intentionally and deliberately buried their dead in a pattern that's much more ritualistic than their predecessors. So you see that oftentimes Neanderthal skeletal remains are found in this flex position, with the placement of burial goods such as stone tools, animal bones, and even floral remains. So you can think about, if Neanderthals are intentionally burying their dead, that shows evidence that they care for one another, they're compassionate for one another, and they're possibly even starting to think about the afterlife. If they're leaving burial goods such as stone tools, leaving flowers at the grave, then they're starting to think about what happens in the afterlife. So some paleoanthropologists even use this as evidence of spirituality and religion by the time we get to Neanderthals. There's just some more examples of those intentional burial sites. The La Ferace site is a very famous intentional burial site. And the Shanidar site also has some evidence for intentional burials and the placement of flowers around the burials. All right, this particular fossil here, the Kabara Neanderthal, they were able to uncover the hyoid bone along with this fossil. So that's that U-shaped bone in the vocal tract that is extremely important for our anatomical ability to perform articulate speech. So based upon the structure of the hyoid bone and also the isolation of the FOXP2 gene when they did the Neanderthal genome study, those two pieces of evidence strongly suggest that Neanderthals had some form of language. Of course, we can discuss and debate whether or not that language is as complex as what we see with Homo sapiens. However, most paleoanthropologists believe that Neanderthals had some form of language capabilities. All right, so this is a Neanderthal genome study project I was telling you guys about earlier in some of the slides. So this particular study analyzed 21 Neanderthal specimens from a site in Croatia called the Vinja Cave. And this is a nuclear DNA study, so thinking back to our sections on mitosis and meiosis, remember that our nuclear DNA is our actual genetic material. That's the DNA that coils around proteins to form our chromosomes. So they were essentially able to map the composition of Neanderthal DNA from the specimens found at the site and then compare them to the DNA blueprints of modern Homo sapiens from various geographical regions around the world. And they found that Neanderthal genomes share more similarities with those modern humans that trace their ancestry to either Europe or Western Asia, which makes sense if Neanderthals existed predominantly in Europe and Western Asia, and they were in fact successfully interbreeding with the Homo sapiens in that region and producing viable fertile offspring, then it makes sense that modern day Europeans and Asians would have more in common with Neanderthals in comparison to Africans and Australians, for example. So this data, this nuclear DNA data from the Neanderthal Genome Project suggests that there was at least some level of interbreeding between anatomically modern Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals, which again calls into question whether or not we can consider Neanderthals completely separate species. Because thinking back to chapter 4, when we talked about the species concept, remember our qualifiers for a species is that two individuals are able to interbreed and produce viable fertile offspring. And if they can do that, then they're considered to be members of the same species. So if Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were able to do this successfully, then it may be more appropriate to consider these two species the same. All right, so let's talk about us. Let's talk about Homo sapiens. So depending upon the region, there's going to be different date ranges. So most paleoanthropologists agree that Homo sapiens originated on the continent of Africa and then migrated outward. They appeared first in Africa around 200,000 years before present. They arrived in Asia by about 100,000 years before present, arrived in Australia by about 50,000 years before present, arrived in Europe by about 35,000 years before present, and then arrived in the Americas by about 15,000 years before present. So anatomical, physical characteristics, large cranial capacity between about 1,200 to 1,700 cc's. Vertical forehead, so we have lost that long, low cranial vault. So if you start at the supraorbital ridge, at the brow ridge, and everybody try this at home on your own foreheads. So start at your brow ridge and then feel upward towards your hairline. We have what we call a vertical forehead. Very small or gracile brow ridges, narrow nasal aperture, pronounced chin. So if you feel your chin, it's protruding or pronounced. The occipital region, the region in the back, is much more rounded in comparison to what you would see in a Neanderthal. The Neanderthal has that occipital bun, whereas Homo sapiens have a much more rounded occipital region. And then from the neck down, essentially postcranially, much more gracile. So the bones are more delicate and gracile in comparison to the Neanderthals. So again, thinking back to Allen and Bergman's rule from the human adaptation section, heat-adapted mammals are going to be longer and lankier. Cold-adapted mammals are going to be shorter and stouter. So that can explain why Homo sapiens and Neanderthals have different body structures. Homo sapiens originated in Africa and are tall and lanky. Neanderthals originated during the Ice Age and are shorter and stouter. All right, so this slide here shows you a Neanderthal right next to modern Homo sapiens, looking at a lateral view, a view from the side. So you can see that the Neanderthal has this kind of oval-shaped overall cranial shape and the occipital bun here in the back. Also really pronounced brow ridges, mid-face prognathism, receding chin, whereas Homo sapiens have this vertical forehead, much more rounded globular shape, the lack of an occipital bun. They have gracile or even non-existent brow ridges, and they have a protruding chin, or the presence of a chin. All right, so some of the behavioral characteristics that we associate with Homo sapiens: they hunted a wide range of medium-sized game animals and had a very diverse diet that may have given them an advantage over the Neanderthals. Diversity in diet, again, means that they can switch food resources whenever necessary. If one food source becomes unavailable, no problem, they just switch to another one. So some paleoanthropologists have hypothesized that this alone may have given them an advantage over the Neanderthals. They utilize upper Paleolithic technology called Aurignacian tool technologies, and similar to the Neanderthals, they also utilize ritualistic burial practices. They have a variety of examples of symbolic objects such as cave figurines, cave paintings, etc. All right, so these are some of the exceptions that sometimes have kind of confused paleoanthropologists, especially when they were first discovered. This is Homo floresiensis, sometimes called the hobbit. So this particular fossil specimen was found on Flores Island in Indonesia and is generally considered to be an example of possibly a small segment of a Homo erectus population that became isolated on an island. So thinking way back to the very beginning of the semester when we talked about genetic drift and we talked about lemurs being isolated on Madagascar and we talked about the Galapagos finches being isolated on the various Galapagos islands. So when a species becomes isolated on an island environment, it will then adapt to that circumstance. So if this really is truly what happened, if a small segment of a Homo erectus population became isolated on Flores Island, then those individuals would adapt to whatever circumstances were there. So in general, an island environment simply doesn't have the same amount or quantity of resources available as the mainland. So generally what happens when a species becomes isolated on an island is their body size will dwarf over time, over hundreds of generations or even thousands of generations. Natural selection will select for a smaller and smaller body size. So many paleoanthropologists believe that this is what happened with Homo floresiensis, is a process called island dwarfism. So over time, it became advantageous for the species to become smaller and smaller. Because anatomically speaking, you see a lot of similarities with Homo sapiens, with Homo erectus. So it could have originated as a species of Homo erectus that went through island dwarfism over time and over thousands of generations dwarfed to a smaller body size. But this particular fossil species has definitely confused the equation a little bit because it's kind of surprising that we find this very small-brained hominin associated with sophisticated stone tool technology that existed very recently, that it existed as recently as 100,000 to 60,000 years before present. So existing at the same time as the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. There's a really good video clip from the Becoming Human PBS special episode 2. So that's available in this PowerPoint slide if you want to watch it after this. And it's also available in the module for this week. That's just one of the summary slides on Homo floresiensis, also known as the hobbit. All right, and this is another one of those exceptions that has kind of confused paleoanthropologists upon its discovery. So this fossil is called Homo naledi. This was uncovered at the Rising Star Chamber by Dr. Lee Berger and colleagues. This particular fossil, when they first discovered it, it had a lot of similarities, or they noticed a lot of similarities between these fossils and early members of genus Homo, such as Homo habilis, but also had some features that were similar with Homo erectus, such as slightly pronounced brow ridges. Some of the fossils even have a slight sagittal keel. However, the cranial capacity is relatively small, between about 465 to 560 cc's. So that cranial capacity is within the range of what we saw with the later Australopithecines as well as early members of genus Homo. However, the date range is far more recent. The date range is between about 335,000 to about 226,000 years before present. So the shoulder anatomy is adapted for arboreal climbing. The pelvis, the pelvic girdle, is very mosaic. Relatively long curved finger bones that are indicating that this species, much like the Australopithecines, likely utilized diverse locomotion patterns. So they were bipedal when on the ground, but also arboreal in the trees, which when you think about it, that's very adaptive. They are able to access food resources on the ground and in the trees, and they're probably more capable at avoiding predators if they can go up in the trees or go on the ground to avoid the type of predator that's trying to eat them. So they have some other features that are similar to what you would see with Homo erectus, such as a sagittal keel, larger brow ridge, smaller dentition. And this site has also been proposed to be an intentional burial site. It is very debated, But the reason that Lieberger and colleagues believe this to be an intentional burial site is because you see the age of the individuals that you find at the site are very typical of a cemetery population. So the very young and the very old. And also at the site, they have only recovered hominin bones, only bones that belong to Homo naledi and not bones that belong to other animals. So it's very possible that these individuals were intentionally burying their dead at this particular site. This site is also very difficult to get to. At some places, this cave opening is only about 7 inches. So Dr. Lieberger had to recruit very small, petite paleoanthropologists that were able to access this site. So because of those reasons, it has been proposed that the Homo naledi individuals were intentionally burying their dead in the Rising Star Chamber. And this is a relatively recent discovery. This was published in 2015. They're continuing to excavate these sites as we speak. So, of course, this is all up for debate, but the original hypothesis is that this is an intentional burial site.